Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Peter Mazza. I'm the First Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of California. Today I'm joined on the dais by Carlos Canino, Special Agent in charge of the Los Angeles Field Division for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and Todd Hamel, Assistant Special Agent in charge, San Diego Field Office from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And also with us at the end are two lead prosecutors in this case, Andrew Hayden and Nick Pilchak. We are here today to announce the indictment of 5 individuals, including former San Diego County Sheriff's Department Captain Marco Garmo, for a variety of charges related to gun trafficking, drug trafficking, and the obstruction of justice. In addition to Mr. Garmo, the 23-count indictment that was sealed earlier this morning in federal court charges Sheriff's Department Lieutenant Fred Mangana, Leo Hamel, Giovanni Toloda, and Will Anton. Related to today's charges, and I'll say more about this in a few moments, defendants Hamel and Mangana earlier this morning entered pleas to aiding and abetting Captain Garmo's illicit firearms trafficking business. Defendants Garmo and Anton were arrested by federal agents this morning and are scheduled to be arraigned in federal court at 2 p.m. this afternoon. Defendant Toloda is not yet in custody. At the heart of this indictment, the 5 defendants are charged with the operation and support of Mr. Garmo's illicit gun trafficking business. The indictment alleges that Mr. Garmo abused his position of public trust as a Sheriff's Department captain in charge of the Rancho San Diego division. In doing so, he purchased and sold over 100 firearms, dozens of which were off-roster handguns. Under California law, only law enforcement officers may purchase off-roster firearms from manufacturers or licensed firearms dealers. Members of the general public may not purchase off-roster firearms on the primary market. One note on the guns at issue in this case. Law enforcement to date has recovered 64 guns registered to Mr. Garmo. As this board outlines, and we also have handouts for folks to take with them, as of today, 27 guns registered to Mr. Garmo remain unaccounted for. We ask that you and the public share this information, and if anyone possesses one of these weapons or knows of someone who does, to please contact the ATF at 858-966-1010. As alleged in the indictment, Mr. Garmo operated his firearms trafficking business for profit and in order to curry favor for an anticipated run for the sheriff of San Diego County. The indictment further alleges that the other defendants named assisted Mr. Garmo in the operation of his illicit business in a number of ways, to include engineering of straw purchases of firearms, backdating paperwork to avoid California's 10-day waiting requirement, and assisting certain customers of Mr. Garmo to obtain sought-after concealed weapons permits on an expedited basis through illicit cash payments to at least one employee in the Sheriff's Department. This cash payment advanced the time required to wait for a concealed weapons permit by several months. Second, the indictment also charges Mr. Garmo with aiding and abetting the distribution of marijuana. Specifically, Mr. Garmo, again, while serving as a captain in the Sheriff's Department and in charge of the Rancho San Diego station, tipped off the operators of an unlicensed marijuana dispensary in Spring Valley to a planned law enforcement action that was to be taking place the next day. Upon receiving the tip, as alleged in the indictment from Mr. Garmo, the owners of the dispensary, which included Mr. Garmo's cousin, directed the removal of all marijuana, related paraphernalia, and cash from the dispensary. It was shut down in a matter of hours. According to the indictment, when Mr. Garmo was told the following day that the operation had been called off, phone records show that he again reached out to his family member, and the unlawful dispensary was back up and running in a matter of hours. Regarding Mr. Hamel's plea, earlier this morning, as I mentioned a second ago, Mr. Hamel admitted in federal court that he knowingly aided and abetted Mr. Garmo's unlawful firearms trafficking business. Specifically, Mr. Hamel told the court that he engaged in multiple straw purchases with Mr. Garmo. He also admitted to planning with Mr. Tolota, defendant Tolota, to create false records to make it appear that Mr. Garmo was purchasing guns for himself, when in truth and fact, Mr. Hamel was always the intended recipient of those firearms. Again, these transactions exclusively involved off-roster firearms, which on the primary market were only available to law enforcement officers like Mr. Garmo. Mr. Hamel further admitted in his plea agreement that he assisted Mr. Garmo's illicit business by engaging in sham loans. Specifically, Mr. Garmo would loan a gun to Mr. Hamel, but do so in exchange for cash and for an indefinite period of time. These transactions were sales in all but name. For example, in one email contained in Mr. Hamel's plea, Mr. Hamel told Mr. Garmo, quote, "I'll stop by Saturday and drop off the money and pick up the guns. If you want to handwrite a letter stating I'm borrowing them, that would be good," end quote. Mr. Hamel added, "The letter should include a serial number for the guns, but no date." In all, Mr. Hamel admitted today to purchasing or otherwise acquiring from Mr. Garmo 18 off-roster handguns. Mr. Hamel admitted that part of the benefit to Mr. Garmo in exchange for the firearms was the prospect of Mr. Hamel's support of Mr. Garmo in his anticipated run for sheriff of San Diego County. Finally, as part of his plea, Mr. Hamel has agreed to forfeit over 200 firearms that were seized from the Leo Hamel Fine Jewelers business establishment earlier this year. 11 of the over 200 guns seized from Mr. Hamel were registered to Mr. Garmo. In addition, Mr. Hamel has agreed to forfeit over 100,000 rounds of ammunition as part of his plea. Regarding Mr. Magana's plea, in his plea, Mr. Magana also admitted to aiding and abetting Mr. Garmo's illicit firearms trafficking business. Specifically, Mr. Magana admitted to engaging in multiple straw purchases of guns, where he purchased them knowing that Mr. Hamel, in fact, was the true buyer. Mr. Magana also took steps to conceal Mr. Garmo's illicit business while they were both active sheriff's deputies. For example, in his plea agreement, Mr. Magana admitted to writing the following to Mr. Garmo, quote, "Give me a list of the stuff, that is, guns, you want to sell, and I'll keep your name out of it until they are ready to pull the trigger," end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, today's charges demonstrate that we will not tolerate the abuse of public trust and those who abuse their positions of public trust for their own personal gain. Law enforcement members who step outside the law are subject to the equal administration of justice, no differently than anyone else in our community. Indeed, no one is above the law, and no one deserves the fair application of the law more than the brave, law-abiding men and women who wear the badge each and every day with great honor and distinction in service and protection of our community. I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to the San Diego Sheriff's Department for referring this investigation to the ATF and the FBI, as well as for their assistance and support throughout the duration of this investigation. I would also like to publicly commend the great work of our team that's joining me on the stage. AUSA's Nick Pelchak and Andrew Hayden, and our partners from the ATF and the FBI. From here, our agency partners will have some brief remarks, and then at that point, we'd be happy to take any questions. Special Agent Keneal.
Thank you, Steve.
Good afternoon. On behalf of ATF, I would like to thank our partners at the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI for helping us, or helping the team navigate through long investigation. I personally want to thank the two assistant U.S. attorneys. These cases are they're not easy. They cause a lot of heartache, especially when a member of law enforcement is involved in this type of criminal activity. ATF is responsible for the enforcement of federal firearms laws, and as part of that duty, ATF issues licenses to those persons who desire to lawfully deal firearms and seeks to protect the public by preventing unlicensed dealing of firearms in violation of federal law. Repeatedly purchasing firearms with intent to resell for profit without possessing a federal firearms license is a violation of federal law and poses great risk to public safety. Additionally, falsifying federal firearms transaction records to hide the true nature of the transaction undermines the Gun Control Act and is a common tactic used by a variety of firearms traffickers. ATF is committed to proactively investigate firearms trafficking activity and working with our law enforcement partners and the U.S. Attorney's Office to help ensure public safety. Couple of things, and I'm done. I also want to thank the FBI and ATF case agents, the ATF undercover agents. As a longtime ATF agent, I have worked public corruption cases. I have worked undercover in public corruption cases. It is hard, it is taxing physically, it is taxing mentally, and these case agents and undercover agents distinguished themselves, and they did law enforcement proud, and I'm happy to be on their team and represent them. And finally, please make no mistake about this. This is not some paper violations. This is not, oh, I didn't know what I was doing. I can tell you, as a 30-year ATF agent, this is a classic firearms trafficking case. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Hamel, and I am an Assistant Special Agent in charge with the San Diego Division of the FBI. Today we are here to announce the indictment and ensuing arrests in a case that involves government officials who abuse their positions of power and trust. This morning's operations marked the culmination of several months of activity by the investigative team. Law enforcement is at its best and most effective when agencies work closely with one another to include sharing intelligence and information and contributing specific and specialized subject matter expertise toward a common goal. All of these elements were present in this case. In 2018, the San Diego Sheriff's Department referred allegations of criminal activity to include a bad actor within their own organization to the FBI. Based on this initial information, the FBI opened this federal investigation. I would like to thank the San Diego Sheriff's Department for their transparency, for their commitment to maintaining an organization that prioritizes integrity, and for their trust in the FBI to pursue a thorough and responsible investigation. Upon identifying that much of the alleged criminal activity revolved around violations of federal firearms statutes, the FBI invited the ATF to join this investigation. The ATF has been an integral partner throughout this case and has led much of the operational and investigative activity. I would like to thank the ATF for both their partnership and their significant contributions to this case. As is true in virtually every FBI investigation, we consulted the United States Attorney's Office at the onset of this case and worked closely with the United States Attorney's Office to arrive at this juncture. I would like to thank the United States Attorney's Office for their consummate professionalism and continued guidance throughout the investigative process, to include identification of the federal charges which were indicted just yesterday. And finally, I would like to publicly acknowledge the contributions of my own personnel, to include the FBI case agents, professional support staff, and supervisory special agent, who lived and breathed this case many days for the past several months. In my opinion, they did an outstanding job and are a big part of the reason that we stand here before you today. Inherent to our nation's justice system is the principle that law enforcement officers be trustworthy in their positions and uphold the law themselves. The vast majority of law enforcement officials are honest and committed to serving their fellow citizens. Unfortunately, a small percentage abuse the public trust. These abuses may take the form of public corruption, color of law allegations, or, as was alleged in this investigation, using law enforcement access to aid and abet criminal activity. It is through such abuses that public confidence in law enforcement is eroded, making the jobs of honest law enforcement officers all the more difficult. For this reason, the FBI remains resolved to combat these crimes, and in doing so, endeavors to restore the public's trusted confidence. In the case for which we are here today, as the indictment alleges, former San Diego Sheriff's Department Captain Marco Garmo used his position of trust to receive information on pending law enforcement operations and subsequently alerted the investigative subjects. As you will read from the indictment, Garmo allegedly alerted marijuana dispensary owners of pending law enforcement operations on at least 2 occasions. When questioned by federal investigators, Garmo denied tipping the dispensary owners, resulting in a separate charge as part of the indictment. In addition to the erosion of public trust, communication of pending law enforcement operations to investigative subjects has the potential to put the safety of law enforcement officers at risk. This is unacceptable. Law enforcement is a dangerous occupation, and Garmo's alleged actions significantly increase the risks to all law enforcement officers involved in the referenced enforcement operations. This investigation is one example of the great work conducted by the men and women of the FBI, working in close coordination and collaboration with our partners. Rooting out abuses of public trust can be exceptionally difficult, but it is a mission for which the FBI is well suited and uniquely qualified. The FBI is committed to investigating all potential federal crimes, including any form of public corruption or abuse of authority, as we have shown here today with this important case. Thank you.
At this time, we'll open up for any questions that folks may have.
What exactly did Leo Hamel want with all these guns?
I'm not sure that we can answer that at this point. As alleged in the indictment, part of the sales, as he admitted in his plea agreement, went to potentially his support of future political aspirations for then Captain Garmo. But beyond what his personal interests were in these firearms, I don't think we know.
Do we know who or where these guns were being sold to?
Nick, do you want to handle this one?
Sure.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Pilchak, and along with Andrew Hayden, I'm one of the assistant U.S. attorneys handling this investigation. As alleged in the indictment, Captain Garmo trafficked in over 100 firearms. A number of those firearms made their way to Mr. Hamel, as Peter described a few moments ago. Others of them were distributed to additional individuals, Mr. Garmo's acquaintances, and others.
Did any end up in Mexico?
I don't think I can comment on that.
Are we talking about all handguns or what other kinds of guns?
So there's a variety of firearms that are alleged simply in the indictment. In the straw counts that follow count 1 in the indictment, it refers principally to handguns, and that many of the weapons involved in the scheme were off-roster handguns, as described a few minutes ago, which are uniquely available to law enforcement. The scheme and Mr. Garmo's illegal business did also involve rifles and long guns.
Can you elaborate more why you can't talk about whether they ended up in Mexico because it's still under investigation? Is it because some of these missing weapons might be there, or what is the reason why you can't say whether any of that right appeared in Mexico?
I'm afraid I can't get any further into that. What I can say is that obviously the missing weapons, at this time, law enforcement is unaware of their location, and that's one of the reasons we're asking the community for any assistance that individuals may have about where these firearms may presently be located.
I understand that the case was referred to Bonnie Dumanis at the time when she was the DA, and no charges were filed. Can you discuss why charges weren't filed back then?
So obviously I can't comment on the decision of the district attorney at that time in 2017. What I can tell you is that the information that was appeared to have been available at that time is different from the information that was developed during this investigation. This investigation, which obviously only concluded recently, developed further facts about the conduct, about the extent of the conduct, and about the motivation of the conduct as laid out in the indictment. And one of the things that is a matter of public record at this point is statements by Captain Garmo in the media, I believe in 2018, in response to the publicity around the conclusion of the California Department of Justice investigation at that time. His statements were that his conduct was not undertaken for profit, that he was simply a hobbyist, and that he had no intent to circumvent the law. I believe the allegations in the indictment today suggest further evidence that undercuts those statements.
This Anton guy, can you explain where he fits in? Is he this consulting business? I don't, it's really vague. Is he just like kind of a friend who helped out with this?
As alleged in the indictment, Mr. Anton held himself out as a consultant, described himself that way to other individuals, and a part of his consulting business was these CCW applications that Mr. Massett described a moment ago. Specifically, what Mr. Anton was trading on and collecting cash payments of between $1,000 and $2,000 from his consulting clients was his ability to fast-track their applications to get CCW appointments with the sheriff's civilian staff. At that time, there was a significant backlog for those applications. Mr. Anton, as alleged in the indictment, leveraged his special relationship with a person at sheriff's who he made unlawful cash payments to fast-track his clients' applications.
And what happened to that staff person?
I don't believe I can comment on that at this point. What I can say is that part of Mr. Anton's scheme also involved paying a kickback to Captain Garmo when Captain Garmo would refer clients to Mr. Anton.
And is there any concern, they were getting their appointments quicker, but is there any concern that their applications were also maybe being reviewed more favorably than anyone else's who was applying?
There's no allegation on that point at this time.
Any idea how much the defendants made through this scheme?
The best estimate of the gross profit would be related to the number of firearms, and so a very rough approximation of that can be taken simply from the number of firearms, but there's no specific allegation as to the amount of proceeds at this time.
Do you have a ballpark?
I don't know.
So how much was he selling these firearms for a piece, generally?
Based on the special privileges available to law enforcement and the California roster prohibition, which meant that only law enforcement had access to these guns, Captain Garmo was able to take advantage of sort of a price premium that he could charge, especially for off-roster handguns. Again, I don't have a specific dollar value.
Can you just explain a little bit more about what an off-roster gun is and why it would be attractive to trade in?
As spelled out in the indictment, the California roster prohibitions limit the amount of guns are available in initial purchase to a member of the general public. As new guns come out, they may or may not be added to that roster. Guns that are not on the roster, of course, have limited availability, and so for a particular new firearm, someone who's interested in obtaining it may not be able to do so, at least not initially. That creates an opportunity for someone to do what Captain Garmo did here, which is to buy and flip those guns at a significant volume, potentially for a profit.
So you're saying these are, in some cases, newer weapons that are not available to the general public?
What I can say is they're weapons that have not yet been added to the roster.
And why would a weapon that doesn't have a trace, can you just explain, just for the viewers at home, why that's significant?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, if a weapon doesn't have a trace, then the person who's buying it is free to shoot the weapon, do whatever he wants with the weapon. Can you just explain why that's significant?
That's one of the ramifications of a straw purchase. I believe, as the gentleman from the ATF described, it's important for the licensing system to be able to have an accurate record of the registered owner of a particular firearm. Crimes that are charged in the indictment, a straw purchase of a firearm undercuts the ability for accurate registration information to be maintained by law enforcement.
Is there any evidence that any of these weapons ended up, being used in a crime or in the hands of already?
There's no allegation on that or evidence on that point at this juncture.
Did you have wires in this investigation?
There's no, again, nothing about that in the public record at this point.
So where is Leo Hamel right now? Is he in custody? Has he bailed out? What's the deal?
Mr. Hamel made an initial appearance and entered a guilty plea earlier this morning. The court granted him a $250,000 bail.
So he's out.
He's currently not in custody, correct?
There's been a number of these cases in Southern California recently. Can you speak to why, or if there's something that should be done to withhold?
I can't speak to the underlying motivation of the crimes any more than I have, or a potential legislative fix, but you're certainly right. I believe there was a jury trial verdict rendered earlier this week on 2 police officers in the Central District.
And then how many CCWs are we talking about with fast tracked?
Again, I'm not sure that there's evidence of that in the public record at this point.
Just a number, multiple?
The indictment refers to multiple, yes.
Any other questions?
Oh, I have one more, sorry. Just where were, I know generally where some of these were seized. Can you do, like, you talked about the jewelry business, other places where some of these weapons were seized from?
So as alleged in the indictment, hundreds of firearms were seized from Mr. Hamel in February of this year, including at Leo Hamel Fine Jewelers, as I believe was stated earlier. 64 or 65 firearms were seized from Captain Garbo.
From his home?
Again, I don't think I can comment on that. I think the indictment also alleges that 5 firearms were seized from Will Anton.
And 4 of the 5 defendants are currently in prison or locked up, and then 1 is at large, is that correct?
2 defendants are in custody, Captain Garmo and Mr. Anton. 2 defendants made initial appearances and made bail earlier today. That's Mr. Hamel and Mr. Magana. Mr. Tolota is currently at large.
I forgot to ask also about his arrest. He was arrested, Mr. Garland, this morning, correct?
Correct.
And was that, he just went to, did the agents just go to his home and he surrendered, or can you describe a little bit of like how the arrest?
I'm afraid I can't.
Is it difficult to go after people in law enforcement in your own business? Is it tricky for you?
Well, some of the comments earlier expressed that it's always a difficult moment when someone who is in law enforcement chooses to abuse that trust. But of course, all the offices you see on the stage today are committed to the rule of law, accountability, and holding everyone to the same standard.
How can the public trust that this won't happen again?
I think today's prosecution is one way that the authorities can demonstrate they're committed to holding everyone to the same standard and ensuring crimes like this don't go unaddressed.
Thanks, everyone.